Hello and welcome back. This slideshow is going to give you an overview of the Orton-Gillingham methodology, which falls under the umbrella of the structured literacy approach. There might be lots of words and programs and terms and acronyms that are floating out around there that have to do with the structured literacy approach. You might have heard of some formal programs like Wilson Language or Foundations, Spire, Project Read, Slingerland, the Letters program. You might have heard of things like multisensory, visual, auditory, kinesthetic, tactile, the 5 components of reading, phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocab, comprehension. All of that goes under this umbrella approach to how we teach literacy. So the structured literacy approach is what we're going to be talking about here, but we're also going to zoom in and talk about Orton-Gillingham specifically. Orton-Gillingham is what the reading specialist in this course, reading specialist, you will be trained in that in your practicum when you take 688, the reading clinic. So this is like dipping your toe in the water and learning about these Orton-Gillingham principles. This is the gold standard of teaching literacy. So when you read chapters 1 and 2 of the Berninger and Wolf book, you will also get some of this background. So I'm just going to talk through it a little bit briefly because I know you're going to be reading about it in depth. All right, so basically the theories about struggling readers and how reading develops, those theories can be traced back to way before we had the technology to prove it. Nowadays, we have the technology by using an fMRI to prove these theories and to see and understand which parts of the brain are activated and what are the processes that occur when someone engages in a reading-related skill. So what we know to be true and what psychologists and neurologists hypothesized 100 years ago was that there are some differences in the brain. So the brain, we could talk about it being wired differently. There's no wires in the brain, so obviously that's a really simplistic view and inaccurate view, but that kind of helps me. I'm not a neuroscientist. That helps me to understand what's happening if I think about there being different wiring. But basically what that means is the brain might take a different avenue or approach to do a task, and it might be more efficient or it might be less efficient. And in the case of students with dyslexia, the way their brain approaches these tasks related to literacy, whether it be reading or spelling or even some language, oral language tasks, it's not as efficient, and they can learn to read, but it's harder, and they're using a more inefficient areas in their brain to do these tasks. So we know that biologically there's a difference, but we also know that these students respond to instruction, and we can rewire the brain. There's no rewiring actually happening. What we're doing through our very careful instruction and well-informed instruction is we are changing the way the brain approaches these tasks related to reading, spelling, and language. We're helping the student use a more efficient area of their brain to read. And there's actually fMRI brain scans that show how like you can see how a child when they're 4, 5, and 6 approach these tasks, and then a typical child, and then how as they go through school and learn to be a fluent reader, their brain looks differently when they approach these tasks. So that is what happens in a typical brain. But we can also see how a 8, 9, 10-year-old struggling reader, their brain is using these inefficient areas, and even though they're not following along on that typical developmental continuum with whatever's going on in the classroom, with our thoughtful and well-informed instruction, we can change that and we can make some changes. So that's the idea. Those theories existed before we actually had proof of them. So that's pretty cool. And now there are different programs out there that try to support teachers in this task. to make it easier so that you have some curriculum to stand on while you're doing that hard work of intervention. So you hear about the Orton-Gillingham approach, which isn't something you can buy or purchase, but you can buy something like Wilson or Letters, Foundations, Project Read. Those are things that are packaged and you can buy, and they will help you with that challenging task of rewiring the brain. So let's stay back there. We know what we've got today. Let's go back and figure out who these people, Orton and Gillingham, really were. And when you buy the Orton-Gillingham manual, you'll buy that when you are in 688, the reading clinic, reading specialist you will at least. You'll notice that the authors are Gillingham and Stillman. So we have a third person to learn about. So Dr. Samuel Orton, he identified 5 types of learning disabilities. These are not learning disability categories that are still used today, but one of those is what we now call dyslexia. And because of when he worked, about 100 years ago, he didn't have the technology, but he did make observations and inferences and figured out that the language differences that we see in children, whether it be oral language or articulation or ability to read and spell, he inferred that those are due to brain differences, neurological differences, which we now know is true, which is pretty cool. So Gillingham, who's pictured there, was an educational psychologist, and she worked with Dr. Orton to organize teaching methods that went with his findings. So he had the theories about the differences in the learners. She was more the psychologist thinking of the teaching methods that would perhaps remediate those differences and those difficulties. And something that she brought to the table, which we still use today in the Orton-Gillingham approach, is this idea that you're supposed to have a rationale for your instructional choices. And this is absolutely the case with our class here. When you're doing your tutoring assignment, you're not just picking 10 random topics to cover in your lesson plans. You should have a rationale based on your assessment. And the first time you meet your student, you'll see their weaknesses. You'll have all that content knowledge as a teacher about what really needs to happen and the methods that you'll need to use, and that will be your rationale for what you're choosing to teach them. And lastly, Stillman was a master teacher. So she's like you. Gillingham was still kind of like that educational psychologist with all the theory, and Orton is even behind that with the bigger theoretical view of it. But Stillman was, out in the field, the one training teachers and creating this army of teachers who were trained in this methodology, which we could now call the Orton-Gillingham method. Typical, Stillman doesn't get any credit for that. I couldn't even find a photo of her online. But those OG techniques were spreading, and there were schools that would specialize in that. She also had that idea of planning the next lesson while you're tutoring. So when you take assessment notes on your lesson plan, that will be a technique that traces back to Stillman 100 years ago, which is very clinical. That idea that we're not just randomly teaching things willy-nilly, we're noticing difficulties or strengths or error patterns with our students, and we're making a plan right then in the moment for what to do on our next lesson. So that would be diagnostic and prescriptive teaching. So there's a lot of ways to be trained in the Orton-Gillingham these days, because Orton-Gillingham isn't owned by a publisher like other programs like Wilson or Project Read or Linda Mood Bell's programs. They're not owned by a publisher or an author. It's more of a general approach. So there are different organizations that offer this training. You don't have to worry about finding those because you will be trained at Gordon College when you're in the reading clinic. But something that all of those programs and trainings have in common are sort of these overarching characteristics. So the point of this, the point of Orton-Gillingham, and if we even back it up, I could say the point of structured literacy, is to emphasize the structure of language. And I mean all elements of language. Are we talking about phonemic awareness, phonics, spelling, breaking down fluency? We could even get into syntax and vocab and morphology and Greek and Latin roots and comprehension. Typically, people associate Orton Gillingham with phonemic awareness, phonics, spelling, and fluency. And that's typically when you would, prescribe OG as a intervention is for kids that struggle in those areas. So that's why I like to talk about structured literacy, because that includes the other elements of language that even once you have someone who can read and spell decently, we still need to unpack word structure to understand vocabulary words. We need to talk about the different shades of meaning and being direct about that, syntax and sentence structure, organizing and writing an essay, and then comprehension skills as well. The OG approach also includes direct instruction. So we are not just reading books to kids in a little guided reading group and hoping that they will figure out this code of language. We aren't just pouring good quality literature on top of them and crossing our fingers and hoping that it works. No, this isn't just about exposure and opportunity to have books in their hands. This is about direct instruction. We are leaving nothing to chance here. We are going to tell them how sounds and letters and words and syllables and sentences work. We are going to outline all of that. Now, does everyone need this? Yes, actually, this is really helpful to all of our students. But our struggling students, like when we think about kids with dyslexia, that's about 15 to 20% of the population. They require this kind of instruction. So how could you leave up to 20% of your class behind? And like the midsection of our class, they need this too. There is going to be, the top, maybe one child in the class, top 5% there, that will just magically teach themselves to read and write no matter what. And that's great. That's fun to have a student like that. But we know that's not the case with most of our students. And if you work in an area where children have had limited access to books and language in early childhood, you're going to have more struggling readers just because of lack of exposure and access. And if you work in a place where there are English language learners, you're going to have even more struggling students. So the OG approach, the structured literacy approach, it should be infused into all of our classrooms. Now, even though there's direct instruction, we don't want it just to be the teacher drilling the students. Like the way I'm presenting to you right now, no good. This is not, we don't want to lecture children endlessly. It should be this teacher-student interaction with the words and language. So you're not leaving anything up to chance, but you're only talking for, a minute here and there, and then they're trying it and you're correcting and you're back and forth. The techniques we use are diagnostic. We're looking for evidence of what they need from us, especially if we're talking about struggling students and we're not talking about classroom instruction. We're looking for what do they need? What are their error patterns? Where's the root of this difficulty? What we do is structured. It follows like a template or a plan. It's systematic. Sequential. There's an overarching scope and sequence. We're not just randomly doing whatever we feel like. It's cumulative, so it's reviewing constantly and making things sturdier and stronger for our students. And of course, you've probably heard it's multisensory. The multisensory piece is important, but the most important piece is the structure. So included on Canvas was it was called the Structured Literacy Infographic. So you don't have to try to read everything here on the slide. You can print out that infographic, and that gives you the info you need. So I encourage you to either, if you haven't read that yet, you can pause now, and I want you to flip through that because I think that will give you some perspective on what we're talking about here. I'm not going to go through this myself because you have it, but what I want you to know is when we talk about structured literacy, we're talking about the other end of the continuum from things like guided reading or balanced literacy. Those are the approaches that are mainly used in schools, and they leave a lot of room for teachers to be creative and use books that they love and use themes and topics that would be interesting to students, and all of that is wonderful, not to mention all the authentic literature. That is excellent. But the problem is that there's not enough direct teaching of foundational skills or in the structural elements of language. And for the students who are wealthy enough, they have parents who can outsource and hire tutors to fill in the blanks, or they have been read to enough, or they have family members or babysitters who can help them keep up with their work, and they'll learn. It will come together. But for a huge chunk of our population, they struggle because we do not teach them the structure of language. And so I want you to pause and look through this slide and know that everything we're doing in our course is about structured literacy. Maybe I should even change the course name to Differentiation and Intervention Using the Structured Literacy Approach, because that is everything I present you in this class will fall under this umbrella and will connect here. So just like I've been talking about in this class, we're going to be focusing on, for the tutoring assignment, we're focusing on phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, spelling. But for our coursework and what we're thinking about for the whole course with all of our readings and all of the lectures, it will encompass all elements of language. So I want you to know that even though your tutoring assignment is zoomed in to teaching someone to actually read and spell, we want to think about structured literacy as an approach to teaching all elements of language. So here's what it comes down to. If you're going to be a teacher who uses structured literacy, you need to be an expert in content. You need to know the English language inside and out. And that's why you're going to be reading the Motes book and being quizzed on it to really help you be a master of sounds, symbols, syllables, rules, patterns, all of that with our language. And then you also need to be an expert with technique. So you need to know how to teach these things to kids. That makes sense, right? But you're not just doing that in a bubble. You're doing that with specific students, and those specific students will have different strengths and weaknesses. So you're going to make your instructional choices, your decisions, you're going to be basing those on what you see your student doing. So you're going to be reactive and responsive. So you know a lot about the English language, you know a lot of teaching techniques, you see who's in front of you, what their errors are, and that's how you respond. We are not doing prepackaged, pre-programmed work that's gimmicky. I'm not selling you some, silver bullet on teacher pay teacher that's going to solve all your problems. I'm not going to be like one of those teacherpreneurs on Instagram who's telling you this methodology is what you need and sign up for all my workshops and this and that. No, 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 no. It's your brain, your teacher brain. That's where the gold is. And we're going to train you to be so smart and so responsive that you can solve these problems. Multisensory techniques are key. So you are not just sitting there lecturing and telling the student, you are involving them at the auditory, visual level, and ideally tactile and kinesthetic. Now, when you're teaching online, tactile and kinesthetic gets a little tricky, but there's lots of room for auditory and visual because they can see your lips, they can see the color-coded things you do on the screen, the patterns that you put out there. So you can really play up the auditory and visual, even if the tactile piece is hard. Now let's get into the 4 principles that will sort of break down or showcase the important characteristics of Wharton Gillingham. To begin with, we're going to be thinking about going from the known to the unknown. So this means when we are teaching a new topic, we are going to build prior knowledge, right? That's just kind of teacher 101 stuff. You already know that, of course. And that's built in on your lesson plan template. If you've taken a peek at that yet, there's a spot when you're right before you teach something new that you can activate that prior knowledge and connect it to what they know. That's true. But also, we want to talk about how this is very cumulative. So we're following a specific scope and sequence, that developmental continuum of language development, and we are controlling it so that we only give them material that they can do. So if on your assessment day you find out that your child is, whoa, really sloppy with all their short vowels, then you are going to back it up to the beginning, and your first lesson could be A, apple, A. And that's it. And you blend with short A. You are not going to include any other short vowels on that plan yet. You're not going to include digraphs or blends or multisyllabic words. Maybe they're in 3rd grade and they've been exposed to all that and they know they can do it sometimes. But if you're seeing weaknesses way down low, then you are going to back that train up to short A, and you're going to start there. And then you're going to unroll slowly. And I'm talking about using a lot of weird metaphors and symbols here, but that's how I picture it in my brain. I am unrolling the English language carefully for my students. So then I move on, to other short vowels and so on. And then on my next lesson, I'm allowed to practice short A and short O. And then eventually I get through all the vowels. I'm going to add in maybe one digraph at a time. I'm going to do initial blends, final blends. I'm unrolling it slowly. It's kind of easier, I find, to start with somebody who needs to start at the beginning. That's always my favorite kind of student to work with. Doesn't matter if they're in 7th grade or 1st grade. I like to just start at the beginning and unroll it from there. It's hard when they're okay with that early stuff and you kind of have to jump in the middle or a few steps down the line. That always feels a little tricky because I feel like, yeah, maybe they're doing fine with their CVC words, their closed syllables and short vowels, but I'm just not comfortable just diving into multisyllabic words with vowel teams if we don't have like that foundation together. So sometimes I do kind of skip jump through the early content just to make sure that we've had that shared terminology and language with each other, because I'd hate to just start talking about how to break apart a multi-syllable word and I'm telling them to look for 2 consonants, divide there, and they're like, consonants? What's a consonant? So you have to establish what is known and proceed carefully from there. The second principle is moving from simple to complex. So of course, your scope and sequence kind of helps you with this because it's already laid out for you. But still, it helps to have this in your teacher brain. You're going to want to start with things that have that are more simple and basic and dependable. So like things like if you're talking about a young or really impaired student, those consonants and sounds are easy to articulate. And so those ones make sense. It makes sense to start there and be blending with those kind of sounds. It's harder to articulate x, w, y, or not even just to articulate them, but those letters are harder to match with sounds, because if you think about X, your mouth goes eh at the beginning, and W, your mouth goes d. So those letters can be a little tricky. Then we get into our short vowels and consonants because that's one-to-one correspondence. It's pretty steady that the short vowels make those sounds and then the consonants, make their sound. Okay, not bad. Then you add in vowel, consonant, E. Okay, so if you pop an E on the end, the vowel is long. Fine, we can handle that pattern. That's easier than vowel teams, which are pretty wild looking. Like I, consonant, E in the word pine is simpler to decode than IGH in the word light. So see, like it follows a concrete pattern, the I, consonant, E one versus the vowel team. A lot of times students can read certain syllable types before they can understand that concept. So you might have a kindergartner who's reading CVC words, but they're not ready for that abstract idea of a syllable type yet. So your scope and sequence, if it's a thoughtful one, will mostly take care of you for this principle. Likewise, your template will help you with this idea of frequent to infrequent. So if you have a good scope and sequence and a good template, that will help keep you in line with these principles. For example, there's a few different ways to think about this principle. One way to interpret it is to think about using things that are teaching frequently used sounds more off, teaching those before the less frequent. So AI is more common than EIGH. They both spell that A sound, but they're not, like AI would be more frequent. So it makes sense to start there and save those advanced or kind of ugly looking vowel teams for later. Another way to interpret this principle is to think about how we're going to review, and then kind of pull back on the reviewing. So something that is brand new that we just taught might be on the front burner and reviewed, very frequently in our lessons. And then as the students grow stronger with that skill, then we can kind of practice it less frequently. So again, your template kind of helps you with this because it has flashcard drills, review words. Those are opportunities for you to practice things on a daily basis and then gradually move on. And our fourth principle is going from concrete to abstract. So again, your scope and sequence really helps you out here because it moves from those basic concepts in the early days like one-to-one correspondence and CVC words. It starts there with those more concrete things, those patterns that you can kind of see. You can see a closed syllable, an open syllable, a vowel consonant syllable. You can see those patterns. Vowel teams, that's getting into orthography, and that's a little bit harder to see. So, and then again, syllable types and spelling rules, those can be considered more abstract. Another way to interpret this principle is to think about how can you take something that is abstract and make it concrete. So if you're talking about syllable types, instead of just rattling off, okay, a closed syllable has one short vowel, it's closed in by one or more consonants at the end. Instead of using all that language, which can be really abstract for our students, just to get all that oral language, to take that in and to hear all that terminology, can be kind of messy. It might make more sense to show it to them. So can we show it using color-coded cubes or chips or cards or magnets? Can we show them a syllable type in a way that they can touch it or build it? So that's multisensory, right? Because there's a visual piece, if there's like a pattern, and there's a tactile piece if they're touching and moving things. So that multisensory idea can kind of overlap here as they're touching that concrete skill. When people hear multisensory, I think they think of a lot of things. Multisensory doesn't just mean you get out some rice or some sandpaper and have kids quietly trace. That's only one sense. That's only tactile. It's not just an activity that gets kids up and moving. That's a gross motor activity. Great, they're moving. That has its benefits, but that's not multisensory teaching, especially if it's just kinesthetic or if it's just moving for the sake of moving. That's great, but it's not multisensory teaching. We don't just do them for fun. We don't just sprinkle them in as the fun part, although often they tend to be fun. Kids often like those elements of a lesson, but it doesn't mean that that's not their purpose, to entertain children. They're not the same for everyone. I've had some kids where tracing in rice or sand feels gross on their fingertip. They don't like that sensation. Or they just kind of go through the motions and you can tell it's not doing anything for them. I've had students who love using little magnets and manipulating them to spell words, and other kids who hate the tedious back and forth movement with magnets. And so it's not effective if they despise doing it. You know what I mean? And multisensory techniques should not be overlooked or ignored in a lesson. Some parts of our lesson it's already built in for you, and let me show you that. Well, on the following slide, I think is where I'll tell you where it's built in on your lesson plan. So here's what multisensory techniques are. First of all, skip to the bottom there. They must simultaneously associate the visual, auditory, tactile, or kinesthetic. So you need to have two or more senses happening at the same time for the student for that to be considered a multisensory technique. The reason we do this is we're trying to build these compensatory pathways. Whatever they're doing now, these struggling students, it's not working, okay? It's not helping to build those relationships or fluent skills or automatic skills that we want for them. So reading, spelling, whatever it is, it's still way too labored, and we want things to be more automatic and efficient and easier. So picture like this crowded woods with thorns everywhere, and every time the student reads, they're like wandering through that forest for the first time, and it takes so much effort to move the branches away for them to get through. We want them to cruise through on a path. So we've got to beat down those paths so they're super smooth. So one thing that would be doing it, like, if you think about with letter formation, how you could have them doing some sort of tactile thing that helps them associate the shape of that letter with the name and with the sound. So by going A, apple, you've just used a tactile technique to link that shape to a name and a sound, because it's totally random why A is called A and why A says A. That's random. That is just, how can students, it's amazing that people have such an easy time with learning to read, some people. It astounds me. It's such a random code. It's just that we've been working on it, probably since we were 2, and our parents started showing us ABC magnets, and we get there. It's amazing that our brain can learn this code and be fluent with it. What doesn't surprise me is that so many people struggle. Of course they do. So anyways, we want to build those links and pathways. And getting past A, apple, we want them to see those little word families and chunks and words and so rapidly identify them that they don't have to sound out app, because they recognize app and they know and then they can just snap it all together rapidly. Map, tap, cap, sap, boom, that word family, it's so familiar to them. And then that goes forward with sight words and with phrases and syntax. And so we're building all these pathways, and it helps to do that. A shortcut for these kids would be those multisensory techniques. So the idea is that they should be simple. This should not be something that you invest in. You don't have to buy really multisensory tools. My multisensory tools are pretty cheap or free. Rice in a tray, touching something touchy like the carpet, like having them drag their finger in that, using color-coded chips or magnets or letter cards. Once I buy them one time, they're always color-coded, and that's that. Using a red dry erase marker whenever I write my vowels on the board, that's simple, but it's powerful. I'm showing them the pattern in these words. And they're to be repeated over and over. Just because we do something once does not mean any student is able to get that, but certainly a student with difficulty or learning disabilities would take more than one exposure. So when you're using the lesson plan template provided for you, there are going to be some multisensory routines that are just built right in for you. So the phonogram and blending drill, that's where you're using color-coded flashcards to drill your sound symbol correspondences and sound out nonsense words. If you look at the week 1 video on your lesson plan template overview, I talk a little bit about that. Tapping out words for either spelling or for reading. So if you're reading a word on paper, like a word list or a game card or a story, and to sound it out, you would tap right under the text, like black. So getting kids to associate like each of those graphemes gets a tap, gets a sound, that's a multisensory technique. Likewise, SOS is just the reverse of that for spelling. If I wanted to spell the word plate, I would go P-L-A-T-E. So I'm sounding out those sounds, and then I'm planning out my letters. If we were in class, I would pull up some video clips right now, but Forgot to take that part off the slide. So I've referenced a scope and sequence quite a bit. There is not one perfect scope and sequence for in Orton Gillingham or in phonics in general. Okay, there's a general progression, but different programs might, maybe one program does vowel teams first, another program does R-controlled vowels first. One program does blends right from the beginning, another program waits till all the short vowels have been taught and then does blends. So different structured literacy programs, different Orton Gillingham training programs are going to have some slight differences. We are going to provide you with a scope and sequence that has about 5 levels, and that's the one that you're going to use in the reading clinic. You can refer to that one in this class if you want, or I can give you something simpler to go off of, and that will help you. You're going to want to pinpoint like, where on that continuum is my student, and then that will help you figure out what you might need to review and then what you're going to do going forward. So much of the burden here is on you, the teacher, but I hope that that doesn't feel overwhelming to you. I hope that that feels satisfying and motivating. I'm not trying to get you to buy a certain program. This is not a professional development at school where I'm going to make you do it this way this year, and then next year I'm going to totally change it on you and make you do it another way. This is me, or all of us at Gordon, trying to prepare your teacher brain so that when you go into the field, you are totally confident with what you know about the English language. You've got kind of this internal scope and sequence of how things develop, whether it be phonemic awareness, phonics, spelling skills, morphology, all those kinds of things. You know, okay, typically in a general ed classroom, this is expected at each grade, but that's kind of in the back of your mind because as a specialist, you're thinking, well, I work with struggling students and I'm not going to be totally concerned with what is happening in their classroom because my job is to remediate and intervene. So I'm going to back it up. I'm going to understand who they are, where they struggle, so I can zoom in and start creating that plan to solve the problem. You're also going to want to be aware of the likely areas for children to struggle. I know that short E and short I, those are very confusing. They're very similar in the way that they're articulated, so it's hard for children to tell the difference between those sounds. So I know I'm probably going to see short E and short I errors. I know I'm going to see some SH and CH errors. Children who speak other languages as their native language, sometimes you'll see that if they don't have a particular sound in their native language, that's a common area of weakness. And so you can know that that's likely something you'll support. I know that students sometimes struggle with hearing the M and N sound when it comes after a vowel in a multisyllable word. So like in the word excitement, that last syllable, M-E-N-T, it might be spelled M-E-T. Like there are just some certain errors that we grow to expect because we know that they're tricky spots. So it's good to know those because you can then zoom in and clarify and teach. And that content knowledge is hard to come by, of course. It takes work. So some of you are going to be starting at ground zero here, and this is going to be totally brand new to you. Some of you went to really strong undergrad programs that taught you a lot about literacy and the English language. Some of you are not native English speakers. So you've had to learn English as a second or third language. So you're going to bring some knowledge to the table because perhaps you were taught some things directly that a native speaker just takes for granted. They just have never thought about. Your Motes book is where a lot of that knowledge is going to come from. That's why you read it now, you get quizzed on it, and then you read it again in the reading clinic. So you're going to have all that knowledge. We're pushing that on you. And then you're going to get in this class lots of instructional techniques too. And the best way to develop all of this is, of course, to practice. So you're just going to dive in with your student. You're going to learn with them. You're going to make mistakes, and you're going to realize afterwards, ugh, I should have done it that way. That's the point. That's the point of all of it, is to try it out, try it on, and see what works. It's going to be great.